Sup?
My friends and I have this annual ritual. Every year we get together and stay in a cabin up north. My friend Jake owns the cabin. Well, technically it's his father's, but he lets us use it for a small fee. The cabin itself is incredibly nice, both inside and outside. Apart from having a mostly wooden exterior, and it being isolated up in the mountains, you might mistake it for a lavish vacation spot. It was that time of year, and we all got together once again. Over the past years, it's just been me, Jake, and our two other friends, Chris and Mike. We started doing this yearly thing about 5 years ago, when we all graduated from high school. We were worried that we'd all lose touch, what with our daily lives and all, and wouldn't see each other anymore. So we all agreed to meet up once a year and spend a weekend together. The first year was a bit rocky. Mike couldn't make it due to being extremely overworked without being able to get any time off. So it was just Jake, Chris, and I. We didn't do much. Mostly just watched movies and played some video games. And ate all the junk food we had brought with us. Then we left. The following year was much better. This time we all got time off from work and met up on the mountain. We almost broke our necks pulling an SUI, as we called it, sledding while intoxicated. We still played video games for most of the weekend. But before we left, Mike had felt bad about the previous year. So he brought a truckload of fireworks with him. We spent our last night there blowing up snow hills and filling the night sky with an incredible array of colors. The next year, we threw a large party up on the mountain. We had invited coworkers, old friends, and it was the first year I had brought Nikki with me. We had just started dating, and since we were inviting pretty much everyone we knew, I figured, what the hell? Everyone had a great time, or so they told me. I was too preoccupied with my new girlfriend to pay any mind to much else. There was a lot of drinking, a lot of party games, and a broken ornate wooden deer carving that we had to pay Jake's dad back for. But overall, it was a great time. Last year, we decided to limit the amount of people. We could only bring one additional person with us, just to keep the alcohol intake and damages to a minimum. Jake, Mike, and I all each brought our girlfriends. Chris, on the other hand, came solo. Anyways, we spent that weekend watching old horror movies, playing board games, and taking hikes through the snowy wilderness. Overall, it was a pretty leisurely time. Last week, however, was anything but leisurely. While Nikki and I were making our way up to the mountain, we had received a warning that a massive blizzard was heading our way. She gave me a nervous glance. But it had snowed up there lots of times before, and I told her not to worry about it. We had just arrived when the snowfall began to pick up. We grabbed our things and quickly dashed inside. We found Mike and Chris setting up a video game, and Jake in the kitchen putting away the food he had brought. I greeted them, then inquired to where their better halves were. They all said, almost in comical fashion, "Working." I laughed at the coincidence and took my jacket off. I asked Jake if he had seen the weather. He nodded, mentioning we'll probably get a few feet of snow, but nothing major. We quickly settled in. After a few hours of watching Chris stomp Mike in Street Fighter, we all decided to watch some movies. Jake had brought with him his famous collection of horror movies, which I wasn't particularly fond of, but I was outvoted. While they put on the first movie, I stared out of the window, watching the endless snowfall outside. The sky was already darkened from the clouds overhead, but was now becoming much darker as the sun started going down. Something caught my eye through the flurry of snow. I wasn't sure, but I thought I saw someone standing out there. I blinked my eyes, and whatever it wasn't there anymore. Thinking it was just the snow playing tricks on me, I rejoined everyone in front of the TV. About an hour into the film, Nikki had to use the bathroom. A few moments later, we were all alerted to her screaming. The others gave each other confused glances as I sprinted to the bathroom. I found Nikki standing outside of the bathroom door. I asked her what was wrong, and she just pointed to the window. She said that she saw something staring at her through the glass. Being the good boyfriend that I am, I puffed up my chest and walked over to the window, looking closely through it, though all I could see was a thick layer of snow falling from the sky. By that point, our friends had joined us, and she told them what she saw. They all thought the movie had just gotten to her, but I couldn't help but think back to when I thought I saw something standing outside. We decided to call it a night, and each retired to our respective rooms. Throughout the night, Nikki just kept glancing out of the window. I told her to relax. If it was somebody, there was 5 of us and only one of them. This helped to calm her down a bit. A couple hours after we fell asleep, I was awoken to a tapping coming from the window. I cracked my eyes open slightly. On the other side of the glass was a face. It didn't look human. Its head was as white as the snow falling all around it, which contrasted the darkness outside. Its eyes were white and vacant, almost as if it were blind. A long, clawed hand tapped a pointed finger on the glass. At first glance, it seemed like it was trying to get our attention, but the way it tilted its head as it tapped made it seem like it had never touched glass before. After a few minutes of watching it, it slowly stepped backwards away from the window and faded from view. I immediately shook Nikki awake and told her what I saw. I could see the panic in her eyes slowly start to build as I described it. She told me that was exactly what she had seen in the bathroom. We quickly got up and woke the others, explaining what I saw. They were all skeptical, but I told them that we needed to leave, now. While the others were packing their things, I walked over to the door and opened it, though what I saw on the other side stopped me in my tracks. There was a pile of snow about halfway up the door. I looked over the mound of snow and saw that our trucks had mostly been buried by the blizzard. I struggled to shut the door, but when I did, something happened that made us all stop what we were doing. There was a knock on the door. We all looked at each other silently, unsure of what to do. I locked the door quickly and told Chris to lock the back door. He nodded and ran off. We all stayed together in the living room, keeping our eyes fixed on the doors and windows. Nikki pulled out her cell phone, but with the bad weather and remote location, that was just wishful thinking. Mike shouted in fear, and we all looked in the direction he was staring at. It was the window right next to the back door. That same ghostly white face was on the other side, partially obscured by the snow. It tapped on the window, then began to pound on it. The glass began fracturing all over. Thinking quickly, I led everyone upstairs to the master bedroom. We all poured inside and locked the door behind us. I could hear the glass shatter shortly after. We all held our breaths as we waited. A few minutes later, the sound of rummaging could be heard below us. Then, everything went quiet. We looked for one another, not sure if we should check to see if it was gone or not. Jake stood up and walked over to the door.
My lord.
He reached for the lock. A faint tapping was heard on the other side. We all sat there motionless, hoping whatever it was would get bored and just leave us alone. Hours passed by while we waited, and not a sound was heard. I got up and walked over to the door. I pressed my ear to the wood, and I could hear a very soft breathing on the other side. I'm not sure why, but this, out of everything, scared me the most. That this creature had been standing there, waiting for hours, without making a single noise. Eventually the sun began rising and the blizzard had finally died down. Chris, Jake, Mike, and I decided we'd try to make a mad dash to our trucks. We were going to force the door open and charge at whatever that thing was. Nikki, of course, advised against it, but we didn't have much of a choice. I counted to 3 and pulled the door open. But when I did, the creature was gone. We slowly crept downstairs and found all of our stuff was trashed. Our bags were torn open. The refrigerator door was practically torn from the hinges, and all the food had been strewn about the cabin. We spent the morning shoveling our trucks out enough to drive out of there, and we all left shortly after that. We all have no idea what that thing was, or what it actually wanted. But we've all decided to postpone next year's trip to the cabin. If it's snowing outside at night, and you hear a tap on your window, get up and find somewhere safe. We all were very lucky, but if we hadn't been on the second floor with the door locked, I probably wouldn't be writing this right now. Surveillance is a growing fact of life these days, but I now believe we've expanded the scope of human sight to dangerous levels. I'm not a master hacker by any means, but I was definitely able to Google a script to break into my neighbor's new smart home system. Believe me when I say that ignorance is bliss, and that you can never go back once you know the truth. I should probably start by saying I'm not some creep. The idea first started as a random thought when I heard my 50-something neighbor bragging to someone else on his porch about his new smart home system. He claimed the security system and all the devices in his house were wired to the same voice command box, and he sounded damn proud of it too. He claimed it was, what did he say? Perfect security. Of course, after overhearing a claim like that floating in through my open window, I made a single search and found a dozen hits for scripts that would break into the brand he described. I laughed to myself and then left it at that. But temptation has a funny way of lurking in the back of your mind. Every few days the thought would randomly pop into my head. I had power. Why not take a peek? It would be good for a laugh if nothing else. It's not like he would have installed cameras in his bathrooms or anything. Nah, no, maybe. No, I shouldn't. But then spring break arrived, and while sitting at my computer, I happened to glance out the window to see my neighbor's daughter coming home from college. The temptation to use the script had already been percolating in me for weeks. The veins in my extremities constricted painfully as I realized I was actually going to do it. During my brief glimpse down into their yard, I had seen what looked like a startling, attractive girl,
and I couldn't connect that image to the weird girl next door I had seen last year in high school. I know what you're thinking, but it wasn't a creeper thing. I just wanted a better look to understand what I had seen. I told myself I would take one quick look and then I'd be done with it. While loading up the script, I promised myself I would delete it right after. Yeah, that was the right thing to do. No harm done, and if I get caught somehow, I could just claim it was a accident. Yeah, I accidentally downloaded this hacking script. That sounded reasonable, right? A black window scrolled text down my screen rapidly for 6 seconds. And then, I was in. Nerves thrilling. I watched breathlessly through a security cam feed in the living room as the girl came in, and then headed upstairs. It was definitely the same girl I remembered, and she had definitely gotten absurdly pretty in the last year somehow. After settling into certainty, I closed the feed, deleted the script, and then spent a paranoid hour cleaning my computer of any evidence of what I had done. For maybe a week, I sat home terrified that the police would break down my door and tase me at any moment. But that's the funny thing about temptation. When no consequences followed, the urge to look began eating away at me again. I had a few drinks one lonely night and went for it before I could change my mind. The son was watching television in the living room. I couldn't see what he was watching from the angle of the camera in the living room, but he appeared to be zoned out. My neighbor himself was sitting in the kitchen working on his laptop. Again, I couldn't see what he was doing from my angle, but he was certainly downing coffee as he worked. My pulse quickened as a hallway feed caught the daughter going from her room to the bathroom, and nothing but a towel. To take a shower, I assume. Okay, borderline creepish, I told myself, but it's not like I could see into the bathrooms or anything, right? Just to confirm that I couldn't, I tried various devices around the house that the neighbor had connected to his system. Most were named with random numbers and letters. But I did find out something interesting. I found out that household devices have many more sensors than we give them credit for. A microwave in the kitchen had some sort of crude light sensor, and the system sent me its data as an incredibly blurry video feed. A large blob of darkness moved in place in front of a bright rectangle of light, and I realized then that I was looking at my neighbor on his laptop from a different angle. In fact, many devices in the house had crude light sensors or audio pickups, and I could hear the shower running upstairs on one while listening to the sun's show on another. This was all proceeding as one might expect, and I might have gone down a very dark path if I hadn't stumbled upon the unthinkable. One of the devices with a very long and very random name showed me a blurry video feed, somewhere unrecognizable. I switched back and forth between feeds comparing the patterns of the light from the cameras, but this device seemed to be looking out on somewhere altogether different. Could it be the basement? The area was darker than the others, but not too dark to obscure strange gray blurs moving against the black. I kept switching until I found a security camera near the basement window. It was the only one down there, but it showed enough that I could compare the blurs. It was less that the objects were moving and more that the fuzzy sensors made the objects appear to move simply because it was a bad feed. But I pinpointed a poster, a chair, and a mirror before coming to an impasse with the final blur. This one I could only see with the sensor. There was nothing on the actual video feed. Peering closer and closer, I tried to make sense of the blob of gray and white pixels as it moved around the basement. There, and there. Recognizable landmarks amongst the junk, but no sign of it on the high-res camera. What was I seeing? Was the sensor just defective? What device was it even part of? I managed to narrow it down to a forgotten digital clock that must have been running on batteries. But nothing about this made any sense. I looked up a script to sharpen the video feed, and I let everything run all night. In the morning, I pulled myself up, got a coffee, and sat down at my computer. And then froze. Repeatedly, I played the confusing horror the script had produced. The blur of gray and shadows had become coherent. But not in any natural way. Instead, it appeared that I was looking at an androgynous gray humanoid form with a pillowcase over their head. Since this was just a graphical best guess, its glitchy movement brought out a severe unease and disgust in me as I watched it jerkily walk around the basement. It appeared to be able to navigate despite the pillowcase covering its face, and it even made it up a few steps towards the basement door before its random movements took it back down. What the hell was I seeing? For 2 days I watched that thing stumble around my neighbor's basement before it finally went all the way up the stairs. It was 4 in the morning and all 3 of them were asleep. This time, it seemed to move with purpose. It was still not visible on any high-resolution camera, but I tracked it from sensor to sensor by watching its twitching blur. After watching its unfocused form for so long, I was beginning to get a sense of where its legs and arms were by the movement and patterns of the gray. Each limb moved as if on different conflicting joints. When it walked, it was as if its ankles, knees, and thighs each wanted to go in opposite directions. And the conflict was only resolved by odd rotations and strange body angles. Gripped by terror, I watched it slowly ratchet its way up through the kitchen and towards the second set of stairs. There was no doubt in my mind that it was heading for the bedrooms. My knuckles went white as I gripped the edge of my table. Finally, as it clambered up and out of sight of the sensors, I panicked. It still wasn't visible on the hallway cameras, but I knew I had to do something. But what could I do? If I called the house, they would have my phone number, and they would start asking questions as to why I was calling at 4 o'clock in the morning. There was no way I could pretend it was random. The only reason I even had my neighbor's cell phone number was that I had heard him say it out loud the week before on one of my feeds. But what could I do? Desperate to act, or to at least see what was happening, I left my computer and crept to a window in another room. From here, I could see into my neighbor's daughter's window, and my entire body ran with prickly terror as I spied a strange gray glow coming from her room. The sharpening script had not been wrong. It had merely been inadequate. My eyes still interpreted the inexplicable entity as an androgynous humanoid with a pillowcase over its head, but it moved through the space of the girl's room like a depressing carving etched into reality itself. I could feel why it didn't show up on cameras. It was something otherworldly, something not entirely there, or something visible only as an artifact of organic human perception. This was a creature outside the realm of human knowledge and observation, and I guessed that it was making its move now only because it believed itself to be unseen. It jerked and twitched forward to lean over the neighbor's daughter as she slept. Quickly and quietly, I slid open my window, removed the screen, and threw a quarter at the glass pane opposite. I ducked down immediately after and clutched the floor in abject terror. The noise from the quarter had been excruciatingly loud. Did the entity snap its pillowcase-covered head towards the sound? Had it seen me? I had no way of knowing. Or did I? Crawling back to my room, I checked the feeds. Apparently completely unperturbed by the noise, the entity had begun ratcheting its way back down the stairs. It was not fleeing to the basement. I watched as it approached the small table by the front door and began going through the mail stack there. It carefully picked out an envelope and crumpled it into oblivion in a blurry gray hand. Then it moved to the kitchen, where it began touching the keyboard on my neighbor's laptop repeatedly for nearly a minute. What was it doing? It returned to the basement and started to move in lurking circles, and I sat and stared at it half awake until a shot from both my computer and my window jolted me to full awareness. It had been my neighbor in his kitchen. He was yelling loud enough for me to hear him in real life, stalking back and forth while talking on the phone. He was insisting he hadn't sent any compromising emails. He had been fired from his job. In the front hall, his son was busy looking through the pile of mail. He asked his sister and father repeatedly if any college acceptance letters had come in, but his father was too busy arguing on the phone, and his sister hadn't seen any. But I had. What type of entity were we dealing with here? It hadn't physically harmed harmed anyone, but it was still lurking in their home every hour of every day, and it had made invisible moves against them by sabotaging my neighbor's job and his son's college career. At long last, my neighbor seemed to convince the other end that his account had been hacked, but he was somber and concerned about how it would reflect on him at work. The sun continued on his day, oblivious to the fact that his acceptance letter had come in and had been destroyed. It was then that I began to think about the timeline of what had happened. I had resisted the urge to spy on my neighbor's family for weeks. Indeed, beyond that, he had lived there for years. If the entity had been in his basement this entire time, then perhaps they were not physically at risk. There had been plenty of opportunities to hurt them directly. No, this was something else. This was a specter of misfortune, a curse, an information parasite. But my neighbor had not been particularly unlucky as far as I knew. Not until he had gotten a surveillance system. A bunch of little complaints I had heard him make suddenly began to add up. Things had been inexplicably going wrong for everyone in his family recently. Alarm clocks had been failing to go off at the proper time. Emails and texts had been a bit weird. And each of the 3 members of his household had a general growing frustration with life. It was undermining them. It was literally lurking in the basement, lurking out of sight, and sabotaging them. And they had no idea. But where had the entity come from? Almost all of the devices and cameras had been there before. The only difference was that they had been integrated. Did observation have an effect on the physical universe? I was no quantum physics expert, but I knew that observation was a critical part of existence. Did overlapping connected layers of observation somehow enable this entity to slide into our world? When you put all the pieces together, did the whole add up to more than the sum of the parts? I began thinking up a plan of action that involved sneaking over there and turning off all their devices in hopes of banishing the entity in their basement. But as I did so, I looked down and to the left at my cell phone. It sat quietly glowing on the table, where I had moved my hand above it and activated its motion sensor. Then, I looked up and noticed the webcam above my monitor that I always kept pointed at myself. Then, I looked to my right at my television, itself containing a sensor, and the gaming console beside it that also had sensors to detect motion, microphones, cameras, everywhere. I had applied for so many internships last summer, and had gotten none. I had missed dates and lost budding relationships because of texting troubles. Everything had felt tough and difficult lately, thus why I was sitting alone on my computer most nights. I sat without breathing for nearly 20 seconds. There would be no plan. There would be no action taken. My neighbors would have to fend for themselves. I let out my breath, put my hands back on my mouse and keyboard, and loaded up a computer game. It would look like I had given up. To anyone watching me, that is. You know that feeling you get when you see something that you weren't supposed to see? That gut-wrenching churn that you feel in the pit of your stomach when you realize you can't unsee whatever it is that you witnessed. That feeling, it almost feels like you've made a mistake by witnessing whatever it was. But yet, accidentally seen something that I shouldn't have. And now, that something is watching me. I doubt I have much time, so I'll try to make this quick. I don't know what use it is to me to give you any warning. Should you find yourself in my situation, there's nothing you can do anyway. At least, nothing that I know of. I don't know why it's you. The only thing you can do is pray that you manage to avoid looking at it, no matter how hard it tries to get your attention. I don't know when or how it first saw me. I guess probably nights that I was walking home late after class. That's where it seems to be most of the time. So if at all possible, avoid a pretty good. But whenever it was that it actually saw me, unlucky. But either way, all it took was 2 weeks of me taking that same way home every night before it had made its decision. At the 2-week mark is when it decided that I was its target. Target probably isn't a good word for it. Prey is a more appropriate term. That night felt just like any other night. I was exhausted from a long day and had my earphones in as I made my way through the park. The park has a lot of trees along the lake and sidewalk. Not enough to be considered a forest or anything, but enough that against the dim glow of the street lamps, they created dozens and dozens of tall, dark silhouettes. It was a little eerie, but it wasn't enough to keep me from taking that way home for the last 2 weeks straight. On that particular night, about halfway through the park, is when it first tried to get my attention. It started with a sound that made me take out my earphones, confused, and I was searching all around me for the source. Have you ever been wearing earphones or headphones and you thought you heard someone say your name, but you just couldn't tell for sure? That's what it was like. It was subtle, but enough for me to notice and stop in my tracks. I can't really describe what the noise was. It sounded like a whisper, but I couldn't make out any of the words. The sound was gone as soon as I took my earphones out, and after a quick 360 to assess my surroundings, I came to the conclusion that my mind was playing tricks on me due to exhaustion. A little spooked. I made the second half of my trip through the park a lot quicker than the first. The next night was different. My morning classes had been canceled, so I wasn't nearly as exhausted on the trip home. My mind was on the new video game I had tucked into my backpack that I was planning on tearing into when I got back home. I didn't have my earphones in this time. So you can imagine my discomfort when I heard that sound again. The bizarre part about it was that even without the earphones, the sound was exactly the same. Something resembling quiet murmuring, just slightly too low to make out the words. It was so brief, like someone saying my name to try and get my attention, but so quickly and quietly that I just couldn't be certain. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I cautiously looked to the left and right of me, expecting to see a hobo or possibly just someone on their smartphone, mumbling under their breath to themselves as they lost yet another game of Words with Friends. When I didn't see anyone, I got the ominous feeling that I was being watched. Thoroughly freaked out, I slowly took a step forward to continue my journey. Without skipping a beat, the sound of a branch snapping on the ground echoed about 200 feet behind me, off to the side of the walkway. Now, genuinely frightened, I began to sprint as fast as I could from the source of the noise. After putting an additional 50 feet between me and the noise in question, I made the mistake of turning around to look behind me. Although it was too far to see clearly, I was able to make out a tall, thin figure against the glow of the street lamp that it stood under. From as far away as I was, it could have looked like a person, but I didn't give it a second thought as I booked it out to front. Little did I know, that first glimpse was enough for it to get closer to me next time around. I got out of class early the next day, and chalking last night's events up to either my imagination or some weirdo who wanted to sell me drugs in the park, I decided that since it was still daylight, that it would be safer for me to take my normal route home. I figured there'd be people in the park at that time of day, and no shadows to play tricks on my mind. Feeling totally at ease, I decided to swing by the ice cream cart that the local sweet little old ice cream man would push around the lake during the afternoon. I ordered my favorite, an ice cream sandwich, but felt a cold shiver run down my spine as the old man lifted the shiny glass cover of his cart to retrieve it. That familiar, unsettling noise echoed through my ears, and in the reflection of the glass, I caught a glimpse of the same tall, dark figure from the night before. This time, about 150 feet away from me. I froze, terrified, for the brief few seconds that the old man had the cover of the cart lifted to retrieve my ice cream. My mind scrambled to remember what I had seen, but what my memory provided back to me didn't really seem humanly possible. The figure was easily 8, maybe 9 feet tall. Whoever or whatever it was dressed in a long black cloak, for lack of a better word. The face was the hardest part to remember. By this point, I still hadn't focused on its face. Not that it made a difference. My thoughts raced, trying to comprehend why the ice cream guy wasn't freaking out with me at whatever the thing was standing behind me was. The old man cheerfully handed me my purchase, raising an eyebrow and asking me if I was okay. I guess I must have nodded because he didn't press the issue. After a short moment of silence, and no terrified reaction to anything behind me from the ice cream cart man, I mustered the courage to look behind me. Nothing. I took my ice cream and proceeded on my walk home, my brain reeling for an answer as to what just happened. I took note that finals were next week and dutifully chalked up the alleged hallucinations to the underlying stress. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but it never quite went away, even after I made it home. I didn't know why, but I had felt like something had followed me home. I wasn't as lucky the next evening. The park was closed for maintenance, my second option being to walk around the outside of the fence, an extra 20-minute walk down a quiet thoroughfare with an iron fence on one side and a poorly lit street on the other. I let out an aggravated sigh and began to make my way along the fence. I wish I had remembered my earphones instead of leaving them at school, because after 10 minutes of walking in silence, a sound made my stomach sink. It started out so softly that I didn't hear it over the sound of myself walking. But eventually, it became audible enough that I could clearly make out what it was. The sound of a hard object being dragged slowly across the iron bars of the fence. One by one. Slowly. But quickly enough to match the pace that I was walking. Only about 100 feet behind me. I didn't turn to look back, but the hair on the back of my neck told me that something was there. As soon as I stopped walking, the clanging behind me stopped as well. My heart was pounding so quickly that I couldn't even breathe.